One question that some of you might ask, maybe have asked, is why are we doing a session on governance at an institute that is essentially about finances? I think a lot of us learned things yesterday about terminology and ways to look at spreadsheets and projections and things that don't necessarily have to do with the experience that some of us have with governance on our campuses. And in fact, I loved Dan Hoffrening's question yesterday, or actually his comment. He's from St. Olaf, and he said, we shouldn't have a session tomorrow morning on governance. We should have a session about how to lobby to change educational policy in this country. And I noticed Dan has left, so he is putting his feet where his mouth was. But I thought David Wheaton, in finishing up his remarks, really set us up perfectly when he talked about the fact that the financial challenges that all of our institutions are facing can't be solved just by the presidents or just by the CFOs, that in fact all of us at the college who have any kind of leadership role need to work together to help face these issues and understand them and work towards solving them. Just a couple of prefatory comments. As maybe you can already see, this session is going to be a little bit different than the ones we've already had. I think Frank and I regard ourselves more as facilitators than presenters. And our main goal today is to get you all to do what you do very well, which is to talk to each other and engage in conversation. And I think our speakers in the last 2 days have set us up very well. I think we all have a lot to say and process, and we hope that will be the case. I guess one other prefatory remark, as I left the room yesterday, I heard some people saying, well, this is pretty pessimistic, or some people, well, no, I'm still optimistic. And I think some of the numbers and trends that we've seen are at least sobering, if not pessimistic. I think we've conceived the session today as a chance to take all of this information to think about what the situation is on your own campuses and begin to think about what can we do about it. And I think that's implicitly an optimistic move. So I'm going to try to put that spin.
Okay. The first thing we want to do is we want to talk a little bit about your homework and about the case study that you dutifully read and provided us feedback on. We have a few observations that we drew out of the case study. And then we want to ask a couple of questions because there were some things that were puzzling. One thing that struck us was the structure of the responses. And this was very, very interesting. And I don't think it means anything in particular. Some institutions met. They talked about the case study, they caucused and they answered the questions, and they provided one omnibus answer for the institutional delegation. We had other institutions who the individuals provided responses to the questions, perfectly valid approach. And then we had at least a couple of institutions that provided a discursive document where you had a response from one person and then a reaction to that response with an elaboration, a rejoinder from the third person. All of these are equally valid approaches, but we also agreed it illustrates one thing that we're going to come back to again and again and again today, and that is there is no single path. There is no single answer on how we approach these issues in a governance context. Second quick observation, the diversity of responses. And that is across institutions, there were really remarkably different ways that you thought Professor Shanahan should get this process started. And there's no discernible pattern where if we tried to link it to endowment per student or size of campus, they were really all over the place. Again, emphasizing this point that a diversity of approaches is useful. Third, and maybe the most interesting observation, is the intra-institutional diversity of perspectives. And that, of course, was best revealed in those responses where you have multiple people either submitting their responses separately, or in the 2 or 3 institutions that provided the document where I totally disagree with what David Schott was saying. He's never understood how the committee structure works, et cetera, et cetera. And so, very, very interesting, and again, illustrative of how we're going to approach this stuff. So, some observations. The issue that we put before you is clearly an issue on your campuses. Several of you in your responses noted that you have either just completed this kind of work. There were a couple of institutions who noted we're about to embark on this kind of a project, and then a couple of others, my God, we need to embark on this kind of a project. Almost, let me give my percentage. I'd be interested in what you would say. I would say 75% of the responses in some way or the other pointed to some concern or at least acknowledgement that you need to think about who initiates the process. Does it emerge out of the faculty? Does Professor Shanahan take the torch all the way? Do you bring the dean in? And how exactly you negotiate that beginning process, that was not a constant, but a near constant.
And picking up on that, many of the responses seem to include a tacit assumption that there are separate perspectives, that there is an administrative perspective that would be embodied in the dean's response, personified in the dean, if you will, and a faculty perspective, and that these are divergent, sometimes conflicting, sometimes competing. I think one thing that we felt this pointed to is the fact that governance somehow needs to harmonize, needs to ensure communication and mutual understanding on both sides. And some of you spoke about that quite explicitly. I think others pointed at it and others didn't talk about it completely. One response that was very interesting talked about the procedures to use and then noted that the case study seemed to be framed in terms of faculty workload, as if this were a burden on the faculty. But this institution opined, the most important goal is a functioning system with good communication and trust among all constituencies. So it ended up focusing not just on process or structure, but also on what I would call the softer side of governance, the spirit in which it's done, and the degree of communication and trust.
Beth and I were talking about that this morning, and one could envision a process in which you designed a new committee structure that reduced the workload of faculty, but was more dysfunctional in the end than it was in the beginning. And so being careful about what the outcome is and being very explicit about that, I think, is very important. Right.
And at this point, I think we go to the questions that we raise, or that your responses raised for us, and that we would like to instigate some discussion here about. One is the question that we posed and that Frank has already alluded to, and that is the question of who initiates. Who is the most effective person? What's the most effective source for getting a governance structure question onto the agenda, or in fact any kind of question about reform or change or shift in policy? What tactics would be most effective at engendering a shared sense of ownership for the process of trying to answer such questions? So should we open this up for discussion?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, let's, I ended with the wrong tone of voice. This is a question. And you've already thought about it in terms of the case study, but share your responses, and let's get some, even some controversy going.
That's right. I mean, it's clearly a concern, and some of you explicitly said this. If the dean picks it up, there's a taint on the process from the beginning. But I think almost everyone would agree that for a successful process, there has to be some partnering between the dean and faculty, or between other administrators and the faculty. And so on your campuses, how can that best be facilitated? How would you do that so that this is really a shared enterprise rather than a faculty member or this dichotomy of an administrative leader bringing something to the fore?
I would just add that there were a couple of responses that said it should come from the dean, and one, I believe, even used the word must. So I think we have a huge range of opinion and ideas and probably cultures on our campuses. So now ask the question.
Right. So, I mean, that is the question. I mean, on your campuses, what kinds of things would you do to ensure that this is a shared endeavor rather than seen as a faculty initiative in response to administrative oppression, or that it was an administrative initiative to pull the institution out of the mire of faculty governance? Now that for two opposing perspectives. No. We want to hear from, this is yeah, that's right. This is just pre-talk.
I was really struck by, I'm Carla from Grinnell College. One of the questions at our institution is faculty can be entrepreneurial and come up with things and carry them to completion. I think there's room within our structure for you to do that, but if you want to keep it free of the taint, to use that language, of the dean, you then are committed to doing the whole arc of the work yourself as overtime. And so it's not that your faculty aren't invited to do that. I think we are, and sometimes we do it. But then it really becomes an issue of it becomes kind of your baby, right? And then to the degree that you can get friends or colleagues to kind of volunteer along with you, you can. So, the question about how to do something that's faculty driven that includes the dean's office to kind of do some of the logistics of whatever it is you're trying to implement is an open question for us. I do think the chair of the faculty is imagined as that kind of position, that I as a faculty member could identify this problem that is a champion. Identifies and bring that to the chair of the faculty, and that he or she would have that kind of role of being, but is also kind of has course releases and is a part-time administrator in a way that I'm not.
Right.
So, but I was just thinking about how that happens. The sense of ownership isn't just ownership; it's also about then you are the one that crosses all the T's, dots all the I's, and then credit in both the good and bad sense go to you.
Right.
I was struck in the responses by the fact that some significant number of responses said the faculty committee would do it all, gather the data, et cetera. And then there was another group that said the dean of the college office has this information, we would get them to do the work, the institutional research office has part of it, we would get them, and a real range of responses there.
I'm curious, is it broken? Is this a real problem on most campuses? How many of us perceive that there is a problem with the way you'd address a question like this, if not the workload? Those are sort of separate questions.
Is this a problem in figuring out how to create a shared...
Right. Is there a structural problem in how you would address the workload problem?
There seem to be in your responses. No, what you wrote down seemed to indicate that. And just to be clear, we're not asking you to describe the mental health issues of your dean. We're asking. That was very nervous laughter.
I think there's a dean among us.
Very nervous. As a practical matter, let's not problematize it. Just as a logistical issue, how do you do that? How do you create a shared sense that we are together? And actually, taking a step back, what Beth was just saying in terms of the workload of getting something done. If as a faculty leader at Grinnell, you decide, this is mine and I'm going to see it through, well, there's a lot of sweat equity you're going to have to sink into this endeavor, right? So just as a practical matter, it makes sense to work in as much as possible with administrators so that they can help marshal the evidence you need, get who's serving where, if there are interviews to be done, who's going to support all of that. And at least on my campus, faculty members have no budget lines that can even buy coffee or snacks or wine or any of the other lubricants we need to get some of this, work done. So just in terms of, not to even problematize it, how would you get it done on your campus?
Well, I think we have 4 major committees, and I think that those meet with the dean once a block. And I think that's probably where that conversation would originate. I know that most of our committees do a lot of micromanaging of themselves and one another, so they end up with lots and lots of work to do. So a major initiative like this might not get attached to the committee on committees to take it over. Usually major work like this gets handed off to an ad hoc committee that then would be made up of whoever the administration and the faculty decided together should be on that committee. And it might be appointed and it might be elected.
Yeah.
But the positions on that ad hoc committee, we've done it both ways, but that's usually how that work gets done.
Could you guys hear that in the back? The appointment of an ad hoc committee? Does that seem like a modal approach at your institution?
I disagree.
Huh?
Charlie's nodding no.
Simon, I'm at Shannon's college also, and we've tried this before. The faculty, when asked how they would like to rewrite the committee structure, had no ideas. And the committee eliminated one tiny committee and nothing much more happened.
Right.
Our bigger problem in workload is we have regular elections and appointments for committees of the college and committees of the faculty, and we know who those people are, and we know who wants to do those jobs and who's doing those jobs. But the deans and the president ask for people to be appointed to advisory committees, and then we sometimes create these ad hoc committees. And we lose track of those people. We survey our colleagues to find out who's serving on which committee. We get incomplete or late or fragmentary responses. We survey the deans to ask them which committees they're overseeing. They're not quite sure either. So these other committees in other places, these advisory committees, might be dormant one year, active the next year. They might be meeting irregularly. Some of them have lots of work. Some of them have little work. People might be coming and going from these committees in the middle of an academic year. So that's where the challenge is. And the Committee on Committees, which I have chaired twice, is the one responsible for this committee structure and for the faculty handbook. So I disagree with my colleague. If we want to do something like this, that's the place the faculty handbook says it should begin. She's right that if we want to do this, we need the help of the dean and the other committees, so that meeting of the 4 committees is a good place to have a conversation too.
Yeah, we've kind of drifted a little bit from the who initiates and the shared sense, but you put your finger on an issue, and that is we have governance structures that are functionally differentiated, right? This committee does function A, this committee does function B. But oftentimes when we get down to the business of actually doing something significant, what happens? Task force, right? And so there's a really weird way that we kind of use our governance system. We use it for normal business, and some would say actually mind-numbingly boring business. But when we have an issue of some import, the impulse on many of our campuses is to go to a task force. I'm not going to make any kind of normative statement about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think many people do wonder why, if we have a governance system, we're not using that.
Well, and in the case study, the president and the dean differed on
Right.
that very issue. So I think we wanted to raise that question explicitly. I think we're pointing to important tasks that get done by task forces for that purpose, but you're also pointing to what one of you called stealth committees, the ones that are sort of off the books. They're not in the structure. They're the department review committees, the search committees, the ad hoc little committees, not the strategic planning or the reorganize. And a number of you said that if you were going to actually take a look at your structure and the way faculty are involved in governance, you would want to try to be sure to include some information about those, and that I think that is what you were pointing to.
Go to the next question, because I think your comments actually take us to the next one.
Yes.
Well, poorly edited question. How do norms emerge regarding faculty work and workload on your campus? Because when we were talking about the case study, Beth and I, many of you in your responses, one of the questions was something like, what kind of data would you bring to bear on the question? Okay, so assuming that faculty believe that you have an inefficient system or some are working more than others, you're going to have to gather some information about what has been done. Otherwise, you're going to get into the biggest bugaboo of shared governance, and that is governing by competing anecdote. Let me tell you my horror story from spring semester about my committee service, and then we're going to make policy on the basis of that story. So many of you, in your responses, you kind of blithely waved and said, we'll gather some information about who's serving where, and then we'll aggregate it and collate it, and we'll break it out by division, and then okay, well, that's a lot of work, and if you're taking it up yourself, that's a lot of work for a faculty member. How do you measure service? And this actually, Beth and I were agreeing, this alludes back to what we were talking about yesterday. How do you measure quality? How do you measure reputation? How do you measure service? Because, speaking for me, and this was the example we talked about this morning, a semester's or a year's service on our faculty development committee is completely different than a year's worth of service on, just to pick one, the bookstore advisory committee. One, I really get a sense of supporting our mission and supporting my faculty colleagues. The other, not so much. I mean, it's work that has to be done. Are these weighted equally? How do you measure that? And so on all of this, to kind of just wave at the measurement question really is to ignore one of the important governance functions we have. We have to talk with one another about how are we going to weight these things? I mean, does one count more than another? Ooh, that's a little testy, right? Because now we're getting into workload issues and how to measure that. And so we just wanted to highlight that because I think it's important. Unfortunately, we have no answers on how to best do that. But just to kind of wave at the assessment piece and say, yeah, we're just going to gather some data, we'll collate it, and then of course the answer will just emerge from that assessment.
But a few of your responses, I think, took this to the next step, which was to look at the question of rewards and recognition for committee service, citizenship, whatever you want to call it. And it sounded to us as if at least one campus actually does have some, makes some attempt in merit pay or whatever to assess what people have done. I think others said we need more of this, I need to feel more recognized than I do when I'm doing this. So I guess that's another question to pose. How can we logically, fairly, collegially talk about who does what and what credit they get?
I was talking with one colleague yesterday about a campus-wide discussion they had had on their campus about workload and the difficult exchange about expectations for faculty for the kind of diffuse responsibilities we have at our institutions. Advising, office hours for students. Do we have to be present in the lab? How responsive should we be to student queries via email or phone, etc.? And how these norms emerge, that's not a natural process at all. And one of the problems some of our campuses, and mine is certainly one, you get into is that we have no shared sense. And so to think about how you might get a shared sense is really useful because those are substantive exchanges, right? Because you really are talking about a shared sense of how we are going to govern ourselves as a community because we're providing public goods. We're providing things that our students need. Do you want to take this one?
There was a hand. Let's take a couple more comments.
So you made me a little nervous with that comment about anecdotes. I'm Lisa Kildegard. I teach the English department at Luther. But I wanted to say that one of the reasons norms don't emerge naturally at my institution is that there isn't any training or orientation for for committee members when they join a committee.
Yeah.
So they aren't brought on board with a sense that the work is important. You just show up at the committee, and then the first thing on the agenda, if God willing there is an agenda, starts to go, right? So that's a real problem. Academics are not necessarily trained in any way to communicate with people, their constituency, to be an intermediary between administration and faculty. Maybe they're gifted at it, maybe they're not. That's one problem. The other problem is faculty aren't encouraged to include in assessment what they have contributed to their committee. So I've been on a appointment, promotion, tenure committee. It's really interesting what some people call service and what other people don't call service. That's like a really big, but what you don't hear a lot is, I was on this committee and I made this difference. I brought this to the bookstore committee. And the bookstore committee decided to do this. It had this kind of action. It made this kind of determination. Or it just kept the bookstore alive for another year. Whatever. So that anecdotal, what people are actually contributing that has value, needs to be included in the assessment so that we can value it differently than we do right now. Because right now you can just have a list of your committees. It's really actually pretty meaningless. That list you would get from the dean of who served on what, it has some value, but it doesn't have the value that it could have if that information was included.
Yeah, I just wanted to second that. I teach with Lisa Luther. I think we do a fairly reasonable job of keeping track of who serves where and how long and so forth, so that the quantitative portion about committee service and so forth we do well at. But in terms of what results in quality, it seems that we would do a better job if we would focus on putting the right people in the right places, right? Identifying people based on their interests and their gifts, so to speak, and identify which committees they would best serve on in that way, because that's what would really increase the quality of service, as opposed to simply saying, let's get this person on that committee so that we raise their quantitative level of service.
And several of you in your responses noted that for appointed committees, there's a survey of the faculty first, expressing interest in which committee they want to serve on, so that the committee on committees or whatever it is has a good chance of matching people. But one of you pointed out that when faculty run for election, many people who are voting don't actually know what that person could bring to the election, and it's a name on a ballot, which is increasingly electronic and not in person. So I think you're pointing to an issue.
Actually, that raises a question for me. Sorry, I'm Becky Matsky from Ripon College. Our faculty development committee is also the committee on committees and also does slating. So your idea of running for offices, we do not do. We don't run for committees. The faculty development committee has at their disposal a large and wonderful spreadsheet put together by the Dean of Faculty's secretary, listing everybody's committee service going back, I don't even know how long. And then, yes, finds out who is eligible to be slated and really has discussions about, well, who might be the best people to put on a slate to be elected. So I was just curious, do people run for committees on your campuses, or is there a slating process? What do people do?
So at Cornell College, we have a tradition of no campaign. So even after a person is nominated, that person never stands up and says, I favor this change, or I favor that change, or I have served on these other 3 committees that make me well prepared to discharge the responsibility of the office I'm now seeking. And so this has always struck me as curious. If on the car ride home today, we should all decide that we want to make some significant change at Cornell College. We don't have a means of running for office and standing in front of our colleagues to advocate this change. We have people heading these committees who are there essentially by accident. And if the right person has the right ideas and the right motivation and the right background, change might happen.
Clara?
I would say, so I'm at Carleton. I have chaired the Committee on Committees. I'm currently faculty president. I would second Leanne's point about nobody runs, right? We have a system where you're nominated and then you're elected. And And what's interesting to me about the conversation is that there's a tacit, the reason nobody runs is the tacit notion that you would only do it if you were forced to do it, right? That it's really, and which comes from the notion it's the least important thing that we do, right? Our teaching and our scholarship trumps our service all the time. And so you would never put yourself forward to do something like that because you only serve, because you were elected, which. Yeah, so there are interesting implications that follow in that. But I also wanted to say, because this is, I think, part of the same thing, that if you try to place the right people on the right committees, I'm just going to say it, because anybody who's tried to do it will know there's a list of this many people at the bottom that you do not want to put on any committee.
Right. The unelectable.
If you try to put them on a committee, the committee will say, oh, please, no. We really don't want that person.
Right.
And so then it gets back to the workload issue, because what do you do? Then do the people who really have been aggressively bad at it get rewarded by never having to do it?
Right.
I'd like to talk to that too, because I think one issue I've seen, I'm from St. Olaf College, Marybrook, and one of the things that we've done within my department is we've shortened the length of time, but we make sure everybody has to do it. And some people are bad at it, but it's interesting because I think we're better citizens, all of us, because if you've been on, even if you weren't very good at it, you understand this is the issue. And
I totally agree. Yeah.
Dan had to go home today, but he's our associate dean of the social sciences, and what he's done is he has made a list of his division, and you're 2 years on and 2 years off, and somewhere it might be the curriculum committee, which is huge, and then you have 2 years off, and then it might be the bookstore, which would be less. But I think that I think we just say, yeah, you're bad at it, but everybody
you'll
does
get better.
it. You'll get better. Yeah, but I think that we need to say that because we're evaluating people for tenure and promotion, it's a huge deal, and we say service is important, so let's spell it out. Yeah. I think let it be important.
Yeah.
We'll take one more and then we're going to go to the next section.
Okay, yeah, and I think this might be a response to a question that was way back, but I'd like to agree that there is, this idea that some people just won't serve or can't serve and therefore they shouldn't serve, right? And that's a problem, right? It's a workload issue. I guess there's another sort of piece of it, and I think it gets back to this idea of why do we need ad hoc committees? To actually get things done if we want to think that something is going to get done. And I'd like to introduce, or at least sort of put out there, this idea that I call the discourse of busyness, right? Is that, you meet someone at the copy machine, or you have this interchange, and everybody has to sort of confirm how busy they are. Even if they don't necessarily feel busy at the time, right? I mean, there's this sort of way in which if a committee is constantly talking about all the things on their plate, right? There's a sense in which I want to say, well, if we really need to get this done, then let's not give it to that committee who's constantly talking about how they have all these things on their plate. Let's actually get it to a committee that has all these motivated people that the committee service will end, right? It's not going to a committee in perpetuity. The committee service will end, and at the end, they know it ends because there's something they can produce, right? So I feel like this discourse of busyness that we all feel like we have to I feel like I have to sort of participate in, even if I really like serving on committees, even if I find committee work rewarding, even if I like, getting together with my colleagues and feeling like we're doing something that supports the mission. It feels like there's this way that, liking committee work is like this guilty pleasure that I can't speak of. I can only
Right.
how busy I am.
Beth's going to share some general thoughts about governance, but as we transition, another thing that Beth and I talked about was, what do faculty members do when they're not engaged in service in governing, okay? And yesterday, I can't remember who it was, it was yesterday. We were introducing ourselves, and somebody said, yeah, I'm going on sabbatical, a year, no service. And everybody, yes, you go! The truth of the matter is, for most of us, if we're not contributing to the public good through governance work, what are we doing? We're doing our artistic work. We're doing our scholarly work. We're working on our, I have a manuscript that's due in a month. I have a performance that I have to prepare for in 6 weeks. And so oftentimes, in addition to this discourse of busyness, we are busy and we are choosing among competing pressures, right? And so it's a very complicated, and that's why Beth and I thought this question of how norms emerge is important, because it's unclear on many of our campuses how they emerge, and even more so, I would say, and this is true on my campus, it's unclear what those norms are, which is maybe even more problematic. So.
Well, and at Carleton, when we discussed norms a few years ago and even tried to create a document called Faculty Expectations, it created a tremendous amount of anxiety among all constituencies, particularly junior faculty, but even senior faculty. I thought we should pull back here at this point a little bit. I hope that the kinds of questions and comments that have come to the top of your mind will stay there, and you can talk more during break and take some of them back to your own campuses. But we are talking about shared governance, so I thought we should talk a little bit, just for a moment, about that concept, what it means, and its history. I think shared governance is kind of an orthodoxy that we all subscribe to in American higher education, both at the university level and at the college level. It's an orthodoxy that's enshrined in the 1966 AAUP document called Statement on Government of Colleges and Universities. And I think we could all recite there are three parts to this shared governance, three parties who are sharing the governance. First is the Board of Trustees, or Board of Managers. Some of you have different names for this. And they, of course, have the fiduciary and the legal responsibility and authority. So they have the ultimate power to make decisions about the institution and responsibility to do so. Then, of course, there's the president. Next one. Next one. There's the president. And the administrative officers who are charged with administering whatever policies the Board of Trustees come up with. And then, of course, the faculty. And the faculty's responsibility is to deliver the education, to actually do the work of the mission of the college, which is to teach students. In fact, the lines are a little bit blurred among these constituencies. The president is usually a member of the Board of Trustees, even though they hire him or her, and the president is answerable to the board. And the president is often a member of the faculty. It has a tenured faculty status. Similarly, the dean or the provost is almost always a member of the faculty, but of course is also an administrative officer. So there are connections, links, or ambiguities, or schizophrenia, or whatever, however it manifests itself. So this simple structure isn't quite as simple as it looks. Now the goal, of course, of all three of these constituencies is to deliver an excellent, a quality education to our students. And I think we are lucky at the liberal arts colleges as compared with large universities, because we really have a single focused mission. A university would probably talk about, I don't know how many different parts of their mission, but we have the privilege and the benefit of a single one. This AAUP statement, if you were to go back and read it, says a couple of important things with regard to the faculty role. One is that it delegates to the faculty education and educational policy. It says that should be given to the faculty. Admission of students, hiring and reviewing faculty, deciding what the curriculum is, reviewing the curriculum, self-governing within departments, programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It also calls, its second big point is it calls for consultation by administrators with the faculty on any budgetary or facilities decisions that have any bearing on the educational mission. And I think we would probably all find this familiar and agree with it. But what's interesting is that there's been a lot of tension, in fact, about what this actually means. And this kind of tension goes back at least a century. I was interested to find a book by Thorstein Veblen, published in 1918, called The Higher Learning in America, where he was attacking the tendency for colleges and universities to adopt a business model of governance rather than something that we would now call shared governance. Even in 1966, when this AAUP statement was adopted, the ACE, the American Council on Education, which is mostly an organization of presidents, and the associated governing boards, which is, as it sounds like, it's an association of trustees, commended the AAUP document, but they did not endorse it. They refused to endorse it. And in that very same year, in fact, the AGB, Associated Governing Boards, published a report called Stronger Leadership for Tougher Times, which advocated a corporate model of the presidency. It advocated, it said that colleges needed a heroic, muscular, efficient, frugal leader.
That's not gendered at all.
No, not at all for 1966. And of course, what we've seen, and we've been talking about this in this last economic downturn, there's been a lot of rhetoric to the same effect, that we need institutions to be more agile, to be able to work more quickly, and faculty are too insular, too ignorant, shared governance is too slow, and so presidents need more power to take action. I think the UVA case that we all read about was an example of that. I think this conference, again, we should all feel heartened, because I think this conference is a signal to us that the presidents of our institution actually want faculty to be informed and therefore capably involved in a partnership with administrators and with the board to make informed decisions about the institution, with certainly our commitment to the educational values, but an understanding of the constraints that we're working with. So I'm about to turn it over to Frank. What is governance? And I think we've already talked about different ways that we look at that, or can look at governance. One is the structure, and we each have a formal structure, a formal description, a list of committees, et cetera. Another way to look at it, though, is how decisions actually get made. And that's the process, and I think that's what we've been focusing on here. And it's clear from everyone's comments that that's as important, sometimes even more important, than the actual structure. But then, and this was clear in some of your responses, there's this, I think I already mentioned it, this softer side, the question of communication. Maybe this is the oil that greases the process or something. Communication between faculty and administrators, between faculty and boards, and I think that's something that differs a lot in our structures. Some have formal structures, some colleges rely on more informal or mediated communication. And then the whole issue of trust. And I think that comes back to the question we just asked. How can we make any kind of progress in governments a shared concern? How can we encourage trust? And I think that's something that it's easy to lose and hard to gain. It's something that we all have to be aware of and work for. Frank.
All right. We have, we're going to get you talking to each other here in just a moment, but we have a little conceptual work that we want to do so that we have a shared understanding together of what we mean by governance. So I'm going to run through a few conceptual elements of governance. Then I have a kind of a stylized governance process. I'm going to run through it pretty quickly. But I think it may be useful once you get to the case study to think about specifically some of the things that we've already been discussing. Oftentimes, especially among faculty, when we're talking about governance, we really are talking about defending academic freedom and faculty prerogatives. When presidents or board members talk about governance, they're talking about the more formalized fiduciary responsibilities of the board and other responsibilities of those two actors. I want to spread that out a little bit because governance, several different things. Think of governance as a way of operationalizing our mission. It's how we actually are going to accomplish the things that we have detailed in our mission statement. That's what governance does. It gets us from the statements of principle. It moves us from our stated values to lived values. That's what governance does. It closes that gap. Governance also makes transparent the commitments we make to each other about our work. We have a new first-year writing program, and we are all supportive of it. Okay, what does that mean to you? Are you vocally supportive? Will you be teaching a section? Will that be once a year? Will it be every other year? Will it be when you feel like it? Will it be... Governance can actually specify these agreements, these commitments we're making to each other about the things that we say are important. Perhaps most importantly, governance establishes processes for adjudicating disputes about our work together. How are we going to deliver this new first-year writing program? We could just get the dean to come around and just throttle us about the head and shoulders until we have enough sections. We could work together to decide how to best share that burden. There are any number of governance solutions to that. Specify how we're going to talk with each other when we need to resolve a problem. So those are just some elements, I would say, of the... Yeah, hit it. And here, we're just going to use this as a working definition today, okay? Governance are the procedural and administrative activities that promote the work of an institution. In brief, governance explains how we organize ourselves to educate students. In the absence of governance, what you have is kind of a, and the economists in the room will appreciate this, you have a real simple, naive market model. When will I contribute to governance outcomes? When my rational individual interests tell me to do so. That may work on your campus. It doesn't on mine. So let me talk about very quickly a stylized process. And Beth has been very helpful in kind of thinking about these stages. This is completely artificial. It's not applied to every single issue, but it may help structure your approach to the case study we're talking about, and we hope that it might structure your thinking about some of the other challenges you have on your campuses. Agenda setting, and we've talked about this already. How do ideas emerge on your campus? Do they come from faculty? Do you have a dean where she brings things and puts them on the agenda? How do they formally get there? And there's no right answer in how that might work. How do ideas emerge? Where do they come from? Is the provost or the dean the principal source of new initiatives? We've talked about that. Who else? Are there venues where ideas go to die? Right? Again, very nervous laughter. Are there colleagues who will dependably kill initiatives on your campuses? I told Beth, I've used this before. Are there people on your campus who you know will kill any idea? If your answer isn't yes, you may be that person. I could not possibly be more serious.
Surely no one in this room.
No, absolutely not. All right. Deliberation and building support. How do you do this? In your responses to our case study before, a lot of you kind of waved at this one. Well, we'll have some open fora, we'll have some brown bag lunches, and we'll share some information, and then we'll talk about it in the general faculty meeting, and then we'll all just circle around the maypole, and it'll all be done. You need to think very specifically about the behaviors, the processes, the structures that might catalyze this. Is assessment information routinely introduced into the discursive phase? Who brings it? I was really struck by our exchange yesterday where we were talking about net tuition revenue and the net tuition revenue by student, which is a really important datum for all of us, especially for those of us who are tuition driven. On our campus, our president, everyone invokes that constantly. That assessment data comes from the president, it comes from the Institutional Research Office. We know exactly what that means when we're talking about making the class. I was speaking at the HEADS conference 10 days ago, and I was teasing some of your colleagues, actually, from some of your institutions. On some campuses, the Institutional Research Office, completely radioactive. And it's like deep throat. You can talk to them, but only under the cloak of darkness when no one is looking at you. And then you can bring the data out like you just found it in an envelope somewhere. But don't dare say that you actually were talking with them in a productive conversation. How does that information get into the discourse? Where are new programs or initiatives discussed? We've talked about that. With whom? What are the means by which discussion will end? Really. On our campus, and we were talking about, I have a faculty colleague, Jorg Tita, he's in the national leadership for AAUP, and he's really stimulated an environment on our campus where you can call the question, it's time to stop talking, let's have a vote now. And that's not procedural trickery. That's actually getting things done. Are we done now? Is there any new wisdom that will be brought forth? How will discussion end? Do we have to have another open forum? Really? And who makes that decision? It's not trivial. All right, decision making. Is the information from these deliberations shared from the faculty and other constituencies? That's what many of you didn't talk about in your case studies. We'll have the open forum, and then we'll have the brown bag, and then we'll have the faculty meeting, and then we'll vote. Well, who is going to aggregate the information from these earlier conversations specifically? Will that be the chair of the faculty senate? Will it be the dean? Think specifically about who's going to do that. How will your institution take action? Is there a vote? Is it a majority vote? Is it a 2/3 majority because it's a constitutional issue? You really do need to know these things as you're moving along with any given issue. And are there aspects of institutional action that require formal approval? Do you have to vote on it? Do you not have to vote on it? We have an incredibly trivial administrative process that I, in my awesome power, eliminated this year without a faculty vote. Faculty members going up for a sabbatical, they have to file an intent to apply form in the spring before they will apply in the fall. That sounds very curious. Back in the day, we were going to use this information for planning, for staffing, and the administrators would have this information, and we could marshal it to do really targeted hiring of contingent faculty. Nobody ever looks at it, ever. And so that's an action that you can take as an institution that doesn't require a faculty vote. In fact, I rung up major brownie points just by getting it out of the way. Taking action. And this is, I have to give Beth 100% credit on this. Originally, I didn't have these as two stages. And she pointed out, making the decision and taking action, those are two completely separate steps. And you need to be clear about what those steps mean. Does the institutional decision specify the actions to be taken? By whom? How many times have we passed a new curricular initiative or some kind of program that really is a statement of principles? We need to engage in a new program of developmental advising. Okay? Well, how do we begin? Does the measure actually say that in September we will do A, and then in October we will do B, and then we will come back and do C? I don't want to trivialize it by saying every month you have a detailed agenda, but how will you actually do the things that you have said that you're going to do, and have you made that explicit? How is action or inaction reported to the community, or which constituencies? I've had on my campus, I've been at Illinois Wesleyan for 18 years, we'll pass something, and then there's an interregnum where it's unclear what happened, and then in a general faculty meeting, someone will say, yeah, what happened to the so-and-so? And then we look at each other like, well, I don't know. It's like a phantom had come in and proposed this thing and then passed it. Okay, closing the loop. This assumes that you can actually take collective action on an issue. How do you close the loop? Are there governance mechanisms for accountability? 3 people just shook their heads. In the action, in the decision, and then in the action, is it explicit about how there will be additional discussions about who did what or not? And this doesn't have to be a matter of calling out faculty colleagues. It could be a matter of us trying to decide, you know what? We don't have the resources to engage effectively in this initiative. Should we modify it or should we get rid of something else, right? Jill said yesterday in her presentation, she said, reallocation. It's really hard, right? Coming up with new ideas, not a problem. Reallocating our energy, our human resources between this enterprise and that one, that's a lot more difficult, but it's part of the governance process, and it needs to be laid bare and explicit rather than kind of swept to the side. Do you bring assessment information to undergird the process? Where does it come from, again? And just to kind of as a side note, by assessment information, and Beth and I were talking about this morning, we are not talking about necessarily survey data or spreadsheets, not that I have anything against spreadsheets. It could be, as one of you put it in your response to the homework case study, liberal artsy information. It could be minutes from a conversation that a group of faculty had at a brown bag, where you're just sharing the consensus or the general impulse of the group. That's useful information. All right. We're going to take now, how are we doing on time?
We're 15 minutes late.
Oh. Yes?
Those are great classes. And I would add one to the piece on taking action, because I think it sets you up for closing the loop. That is the question, what are the costs involved in the proposed action? And where do we imagine them coming from? Because then you can go to the last set of questions, closing the loop about accountability, and say, what are the trade-offs? But unless you know, that is, how might we reallocate? Unless you know and are explicit about what those costs are, and they may be faculty time, they may be money, they may be buildings. Unless you're explicit about what they are, you don't know what kind of reallocation might be needed, and so you can have that discussion. But I think too often, that's a key question that's missing in our.
And it strikes me that that information needs to be addressed in the prior step, too, the institutional decision making, so that when people make the decision, however it's done, there's some sense of what the cost will be, so they don't come up only later.
Right.
And then, as you say, that will then inform closing the loop. That's a really good
I think that's really well.
For me, what I heard yesterday, I learned a tremendous amount. That was that too often, well, personnel, as we saw, as people, are 60% of the college's costs. And so I think that, discussing the way the time is used by people in college is essential to discussions of the economic and financial future of colleges. But too often I think that an explicit discussion of those costs are missing in the kinds of decisions that are discussed by.
I think that's exactly right, and the financial costs, obviously, I mean, as we discussed yesterday, but the human resources that are necessary to carry out some of our work. All too often we establish programs in which faculty will move into and out of, depending on their interests that academic term. Well, economists call that market failure oftentimes, when you don't have actors who are willing to enter. And so explicitly taking that up earlier is better. We are predictably behind schedule. Can we take a 10-minute break? And when you come back, we are going to talk about an incredibly prestigious institution Halcyon College.
Which is to say, we have a new case study for you.
Yes.
We're going to have a new discussion. When you come back, we want to be sure that the small group discussions that we're going to assign are heterogeneous by institution. So when you come back, we'd like you to go back to the table you sat at for dinner.
Yes.
Which we're very carefully, we don't have the table numbers, but we can remember it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I think.
Yep.
I think I got that right.
Yep.
You'll remember. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it's time to reconvene at the tables. I think I gave you the wrong table numbers at the end of our conversation, but find each other and sit at a table. And those of you who want to fill in, on your table you'll find the case study that we want you to speed read and then talk about. Fill in an empty chair if you feel dispossessed in some way. The reason we are asking you to reshuffle is that we want to be sure that the small group discussions are heterogeneous and that as many different institutions are represented as possible, and we want each of you to be with people from a lot of other different institutions and not your own. We hope you'll talk with your institutional colleagues about this, but not at this very moment. In the case study about Halcyon College, you'll see that we have designed a scenario and even included something about the governance structure that does not replicate any one of our colleges here. This is a fictional case, and it's not even a composite average case. We just pulled things out of the air. We got ideas from our heads. We got ideas from some of your structures on campus. We have a series of questions at the end of the case study you'll see that we want you to consider, and we'd like each group to appoint a spokesperson, someone to report back to briefly summarize your group's answers, and we hope to get some real dialogue going. And we don't want you just to craft a plan to plan. We want you to actually get into the weeds. Now, you don't have all the details that you would like to know or that you would know if you were actually at Halcyon College. But if you need to, just make up some things. But really think about details as you get into it.
All right, just a few facts about the case. I think you'll find Halcyon College will not be unfamiliar to you, or at least there will be elements of Halcyon that you'll recognize. President Vagoda and Provost Tuinal face a significant challenge, and there are many, many different directions one might take. That's by design. You should note, once you finish reading the narrative of the case study, and I think Beth just alluded to this, we do have some facts about Halcyon College in the end, a fact sheet that gives you some basic governance structure, and also some financial information that should frame some of your recommendations here in a few minutes. So if you'll take a few minutes to read the case, and then what we're going to ask is on each table, these are 10 tops, if you'll just split into two groups, so groups of 5 or 4. What we found in the past with case studies, if the groups are larger than 5, what you end up with are 2 parallel conversations that are going on into each breakout group. So maximum of 5 people in each group. You may begin. Let's even if Beth, and particularly me, confession time, had been able to stick to our allotted time earlier, we wouldn't have had enough time, I think, to do the case study justice. And so I think it is time to start sharing some of our insights with each other.
Okay, I think these are the questions that you have just been discussing, and we can't begin to hear everybody's good ideas and interesting responses, so we'll try to sample what you've been talking about. The first question, what are the steps that Provost 2-0 should take? Be specific in justifying the sequence of initial steps. Which group would like to share your response to that? Looking for volunteers.
Oh, come on.
Okay.
We said there's sort of two things that the provost needs to do. First, she needs to have a conversation with the faculty about the situation, explaining what's going on and why this two-pronged approach needs to occur. And then...
and with the faculty meaning the full faculty?
The full faculty, right. Because eventually the full faculty is going to be involved at some level. Right, which is the discussion. They need to understand the situation. Then we thought that the provost needs to also talk to the FPC, and that will depend a lot on campus culture, because is the current structure sufficient? Does the current structure provide faculty buy-in? Is the culture such that current committees do that kind of work, or are they sent somewhere else? What's the workload? So in conversation with that group, they need to sort of decide, and also in consultation with the last two groups, the curriculum committee and the FPC, they need to decide, because those are the two committees that are mostly responsible for these things. There needs to be a conversation about what would be the best process for this based on that canvas.
Can I ask, did any of the other groups have a different approach than to begin with kind of a town hall bloodletting? And is there anyone else who had a different approach for that initial step? Because I at least heard 2 or 3 tables talking about a different approach from the beginning.
We did discuss letting the full faculty know at least what is going to be happening in a general sense, but we also thought that perhaps the provost should check data on the campus gained from institutional research. We're assuming they have an office, and then probably come up with her own opinion first, just so that that's out there and the faculty don't feel like they're having to guess at what is going on in her head and what might already be an agenda.
Her own opinion on the approach. Her own opinion on
what perhaps ought to happen, cutting a program, adding a new program, something like that.
Right.
And our moderate position on that was to present a range of options to the committees. So the faculty policy committee, shall we present the question, shall we do it within our existing committees or super committee, you decide. And we could do this through retention or retirements, or slowly, or we could do this through cutting departments. What do you think to the curriculum committees?
I think I might be the terrorist in the room. I am on the no-fly list, but essentially the agenda has already been set at this point. And I guess my concern and some of our concern at this table was, is this how you want to start the discussion with the agenda already being set? So is this what's on the table? Essentially, you've already, the options are quite narrow at this point already.
Right.
The faculty is being asked, which limb would you like to cut off?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Are there any other options?
Right.
Is there a way to frame the discussion differently from the start?
Maybe, but not at Halcyon. And I think that's a legitimate question. And I mean, Beth, David, and I were talking in the back. It's very similar to a natural disaster. This is a negative externality. It's like a tornado is hit. You can discuss your feelings about the tornado's arrival, but it's a material reality that has to be engaged. And so, I mean, absolutely, are there other ways that we could do this besides getting rid of 7 faculty lines? Maybe in a different case study, but not at Halcyon.
And maybe we can all hope or ensure that at our college there would have been a little more dialogue first.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's right. But I mean, for the purposes of drama, we have to get to the point where we're, starting to deliberate. We could have provided backstory, but then that would have been a 5-page case study about the to and fro.
But I guess this happens. I was a part of a committee that was charged essentially with doing just this, and the suggestion I made wasn't on the agenda, and I was no longer on the committee.
Yeah.
So, at what point is there really room for discussion?
And what I would say is, just for the purposes today, just so you can feel better about it, there was extended discussion on the board with the administration and faculty leaders about really this is the only financial option we have ahead of us. All right, I'll just add that.
Okay.
With a whim.
Wait a minute.
That's right, I just did that.
The president has taken a cut in pay, and we've raised $20 million.
Right.
Right. So just say that.
And
we've
fired
done all the
our
other
staff.
things.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and so any subsequent answers that invoke fairies or goblins or any other magical process.
Or terrorists.
That's right, or terrorists.
Go ahead.
Our group likewise felt we should start with a general announcement at a faculty meeting, but we felt that the president should do that announcement.
Yeah.
And maybe and provide information to the faculty as a whole about the why. And maybe we talked about having a member of the board there, and then we thought maybe that wouldn't be such a good idea. But that might depend on the situation. But the president should be the face of any significant change of this sort.
Well stated.
Good. Okay, shall we go on to the next one? Should the planning process be delegated to an existing committee or committees or a new group formed, and if so, how? And we've already begun to hear an answer to this, but which table that didn't lead off last time, or which group would like to answer that one? Okay.
We said standing committees, but I think the interesting thing that we were discussing was that the two committees that seemed to be the most important in this regard were curriculum, to talk about the programs that you might, or persons, lines, and also the resource and planning committee. But we wanted to start with the curriculum committee and have them tell the resource and planning, this is the kind of curriculum we want. How might that be resourced differently, as opposed to sort of having them meet together? I mean, they could go back and forth, and there has to be discussion between them, but we wanted to start with a faculty assertion of this is the curriculum that we need to have.
Which in effect is staying mission focused.
Exactly.
On the education of the students, yes.
Yes, I think that our group thought that what we were talking about in the scope was going to affect the work of all these committees, and so we came up with a kind of representative system. We'd ask for a representative of all these committees and maybe add 2 other faculty, and that way we would have, there would be some more communication, so spread the communication around all our committees in some much.
Right. And so that's a sort of hybrid between what Vagoda was saying, do a task force, and what Tuanal was saying, well, let's use the existing structure. And you're saying let's use the existing structure, but construct more communication and collaboration.
Yeah, our hybrid formula was a little different. The idea of using curriculum and resource and planning, but also, for instance, possibly resource and planning might not be chaired by the provost, but a co-chair with a faculty member, and curriculum adding the director of admissions.
We've on my campus, we've used the model when we've had some difficult things where you have an administrator and then you have a faculty leader and you co-chair the initiative. And so people feel, at least mechanistically, everybody's at the table.
And especially in this case with the provost being such an important player, you know, and which side is she speaking for?
Right.
It might not be appropriate for her to chair this particular committee.
Can I back up a little bit, though, to the curriculum committee? And because I've heard some discussion about this in the other groups, and maybe another group can respond. On the issue of curricular innovation, the curriculum committee, I think, almost everyone agrees that they have to be part of that discussion. Where are they going to get their information? And on what basis will they make their decisions about these new curricular initiatives? I'm interested in what you said about that, because I heard 2 or 3 different things walking around.
We're now on question 3.
Yeah.
Which is good.
We talked about that at our table and had a range of opinions, because this is my opinion. The faculty being asked to identify new curricular areas of that would be attractive to Halcyon prospective students. In my mind, this is the Cookie Monster. This is what we do best. We could have a program in this. We could have a program in that. So faculty are at their best when they're really imagining the scope and shape of intellectual work that might attract students. But in the end, that is kind of fantasy. I mean, the discussions I've been in 23 years of my institution, every new program has come forward and said this will attract students. And really only in 1 out of the 4 or 5 cases has that really materialized. So it's a tricky thing to imagine a curriculum which will do this thing with incoming students that interject in that very complicated gestalt about students deciding where they're going to go to college. It's not a one-to-one correlation like that. We have a nursing program. Oh, yeah, we're going to get more students because we have a nursing program. Well, not necessarily. I mean, we have to kind of have that. So we at our table were sort of mixed on, well, how do you have a discussion among faculty about curriculum that's fair, both from the point of view of attracting students, we think this will bring in, and also realistic about programs that are no longer doing that. That to me is really the issue about getting a curriculum committee involved. Of course, that's a place for the conversation, but those conversations could go on for 3 years and nothing could happen.
No, and we knew we were leaving a big hole in the case study by not explaining who the potential students were, what the demographics were, where this college is located. Is it in urban areas, rural areas? So I think you're raising really good questions that would have to be answered locally, and you're also pointing to the difficulties. I think you're also pointing to why the new dean of admissions needs to be involved, hoping for some new vision. Was there another hand?
Yes, am I over here? No? Change your mind.
One thing that we added to this thing about what information would be needed for the full faculty was a sense of, and I don't know if this would come out of the full faculty or from this representative committee, which we came up with a similar idea, and that is some kind of list of guiding principles by which these decisions might be arrived at, that the faculty bought into before the process starts, that are consistent with, so both for cutting faculty and starting new programs, that are consistent with the college's identity, that are consistent with, you know, who are we as Halcyon, that the faculty could buy into at the start, that would maybe provide some faith and buy-in.
Those things are much easier to engage in the abstract as principles before you get down to the nitty-gritty. Can I push a little bit, though, on the new curriculum and how one would do that? Any new curricular initiative, you're getting rid of 7 people. Okay, so if the charge is also to come up with an innovative new curricular impulse, there is an immediate resource issue that is actually making things worse, right? Because any of us in here could start a new initiative if, give me 3 FTE, we're off to the races. Well, now you're 10 down instead of 7. And so how would that be negotiated at Halcyon? I mean, how would you figure out how, perhaps these would be interdisciplinary programs, how would that conversation proceed? Obviously in the curriculum committee. Anybody got any ideas on that one?
Yes.
Well, I'll give you the general stuff. We thought overall, everybody on this joint committee, we had the same idea, should be getting some demographic data on different departments and existing programs from institutional research again, and ideas of change over time, which might help a discussion of new kinds of programs. Perhaps you could see that there's been some growth in a certain program, and that could be sort of augmented. And then we thought, you know, maybe we'd want some, some external info on peer institutions, your competitors, your aspirants. I don't know how easy it would be to obtain that data, but you know, have they started something new? Has it worked for them? Has it not worked for them? Do we want to try to copy something? Do we want to try something completely different so that we are offering different things to prospective students? Both of those. And then again, I like the statement of principles. We also talked about some kind of, you know, keeping the mission, you know, in front of everybody as well. You want to add to that, Sarah?
Well, I have a new idea we didn't talk about, but as you were talking, I thought to myself, oh, these two things shouldn't happen at the same time.
Yeah.
And then I thought, well, actually, they should happen at the same time, but the curricular innovation should be informed by the cuts. So that, say, as McAllister did, you get rid of your speech and communications department as part of your reducing FTE, and you realize that the people that are still going to be part of your campus that came out of that are actually humanities and cultural studies types who could be unified with two other people who didn't feel like they had homes before, and you're going to push into that. You could do the same thing with an environmental studies program that takes from, and so that's a possibility.
Yeah.
I mean, presumably the point of the new students is to increase revenue, but we never said that we're going to increase the size of the student body. So presumably you're looking for programs that will not only attract students, but students who can pay more. And I'm very skeptical of the idea that you could design a program that would capture the zeitgeist of students out there, that would also attract that very particular type of student, and that would make the faculty comfortable that it's consistent with our mission as a liberal arts college.
Right.
So frankly, I'm a little bit skeptical that this half of the equation is going to end up bringing in more money in any meaningful way, because it's either going to be resource, sucking, or it's going to be just, we think it'd be a really cool idea. It turns out students don't, or students who want to pay more don't. So I'm a little skeptical about this whole half of the problem.
And you're implicitly suggesting that if the new program requires 3 new people, then actually 10 people would have to be cut. Then that's a really costly mistake if it turns out to be a mistake. I think what was implied back here, though, is maybe there are some new combinations of people already here. Maybe there's some things that people actually are interested in collaborating with a few other people, and with existing resources, people could shift a course or two that they teach and create something new. So I think I'm hearing those two things implicitly.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think your skepticism is well grounded and probably universally shared. But to kind of force the issue of engaging the governance system, the temptation was actually to take President Vigoda and start describing him in horribly, he's got moles all over his head or something. He's just an evil person. Because this decision and the way that it's come down at Halcyon College is all of our worst nightmare, right? I mean, we're getting rid of 7 people. I mean, is that, we're doing that? Have we not talked about anything else? And most of the time that doesn't happen in institutions like ours, but it does kind of force the issue, right? Where now we've got to figure out a way. Beth and I have, over the past 6 weeks talking with each other, I've repeated to her the phrase, decisions will be made, right? And at Halcyon College, I heard several of you say, well, we can not like it all we want. But at least the way the case study reads, the board has spoken, decisions will be made, and faculty can engage or not. And most of our work is not structured in such a heinous, horrible way, but seemed useful for the case study.
Yes.
I think the last thing I said to our table was, all this discussion is relevant, but it's also to frame the discussion, to remind each other what your job is. I mean, the trustee's job is to make sure the bills can be paid. The faculty's job is to teach. I mean, and hopefully participate in decision making, but ultimately, we don't make those kinds of decisions. Someone else, and you're right, decisions will be made, but it's also handy to remember whose job is what at the bottom line.
Yeah, and I would say, however, and Beth may have some thoughts on this as well, is these decisions are affecting the reputation and the quality of Halcyon College. And one of my experiences has been, and I think I said something like this earlier, if faculty are not engaged in these governance decisions, very serious ones, and we instead do our work, which is essentially what you're saying. I have artistic, scholarly work to do. I have students to teach. then we really are kind of giving up our voice for the quality and the reputation.
I think you misunderstood me. I'm just saying that at the end of the day, the trustees can't teach our students.
Oh, right.
And we can't pay the
you're
bills.
right.
So when you frame the discussion, and not in a dictatorial way, but just say, we each, the three-headed monster, respect each other's head. But we all don't think exactly the same way.
That's right.
And we're not supposed to.
Yep.
Right. And then I guess the way that this exercise has been designed, it's focused very much on process and structure. But on my campus, it also matters who is involved in which structure. And for example, I can imagine the two administrations I've worked under. Faculty perspectives on what was happening might be somewhat different, depending on who was talking and who was giving the message. And so, following on what David said, trust is really important among these three different groups, but that varies with personalities and experiences.
Right, and I think you're getting at our fourth question: how should the discussion best be structured to optimize whatever trust is there, to optimize communication? And we know only a little bit about Halcyon College, so we have to extrapolate a bit. But and we wanted you to focus on Halcyon, but we trust you're also thinking about your own institutions. You had your hand up?
Yeah, I think this relates to part of what we were talking about with what information will be needed for the coming discussion. In that, I think the faculty needs to know how much autonomy is really being given. If you go through the process, no matter what the process is, and you come up with a decision, is that really their decision to make? Yeah. And you've implied this, I think, with your business concentration that is more popular with the trustees than it is with the faculty. Yes. Are the trustees really saying, this is your ball game, you have the authority to umpire it? In which case, I think it would come off a lot better, with a real respect for autonomy.
Thank you so much.
This is a wonderful segue to the next question that we haven't given you yet explicitly that we wanted to talk about in our last 15 minutes, which we're approaching. And I don't mean to cut off other discussions, so bring it back in a minute. And that is, who makes the decision? How does the decision actually get made? And I know from a couple of conversations that I overheard that some of you very explicitly have already talked about this. David, you were talking about the responsibility of the trustees, and I think the implicit thing that Frank was saying, if the faculty doesn't make a recommendation, the trustees are going to decide without one. But I guess I'm inviting those of you who discussed that question to come forward now, and then we can have some more general discussion about that.
I think a lot of it's going to depend on specifics of the Constitution that are bylaws that aren't here, because at McAllister, we cannot add or discontinue a program without the faculty vote. And if you set up the case studies you have with the C2 condition, that there's this tension over interdisciplinary sort of student drawing, business, economics kind of things in the larger framework of dispute about humanities versus math in our post-2008 world, then there's going to be a strong incentive for the provost and president to do this through allocations and process, which at McAllister, they can make allocations, individual decisions, without faculty approval. So you're going to have you're setting up a situation in which you're going to get a decision top down.
Right.
Other responses? Back table.
No. We discuss this a lot, also because we have a McAllister person at our table, and some of our other campuses do things differently. We thought that the process, coming forward was important. Obviously, having this joint committee meet, taking it to the faculty probably over an extended period as much as possible, several meetings, one meeting to go crazy, calm down, another meeting to come back, take this information to the provost, but we decided we were quite okay with making it clear that the ultimate decision was the provost's, and that removes from the faculty a lot of the issues that get in the way of collegiality and this competition among fiefdoms, as Sarah said, that should be the provost's decision, and we were good with that.
Can I ask just a very narrow question along those same lines? Maybe you didn't get this far. How many of you talked about the faculty, however you structured it, coming up with a set of recommendations that were then given to the provost. And then the provost either takes the recommendations or not. That's what you're talking about. Okay.
And I just wanted to add to that, that I think around the table, some of us were very envious of the fact that McAllister has in their governance structure acknowledged that things must be removed, right? Because I think a lot of us removed from the curriculum. I think a lot of us are on the edge of, or have already dealt with the fact that things must be reduced and eliminated, and that you can't just keep building indefinitely, right? That's part of the crisis. So the fact that there are policies that acknowledge it.
We have a mechanism to remove. We haven't acknowledged that we need to remove.
At least you got a mechanism.
That's but I think just having a procedure would get many of our institutions further along. And I would still want to give it to the provost and have the provost own the decision.
Right.
But just the fact that somewhere in your document, somewhere in your handbook, it acknowledges that we don't just build, we also eliminate, right? I mean, there's a trade-off.
I think that procedural issue that you're talking about is incredibly useful, and in an ad hoc way, it gets back to the question that we were just talking about. And I'm so glad that you noticed I nested the business, the expansion of I was hoping somebody would see that. What are they up to? In an ad hoc way, we can get clarification on what exactly that means, right? As you were saying, is this our decision to make? Or are you saying you can innovate all you want as long as we have this new business program that we are suggesting? And those things can be laid bare depending on how you structure these conversations, right? And then transparency is always better for everybody. Because then you're not trying to infer what someone else is thinking, you can actually ask them.
Were there any other responses to the ultimate decision-making question that we hadn't asked but some of you talked about? Or now, off the top of your heads?
This isn't exactly a response to that, but we haven't really talked about the faculty's role with respect to protecting tenure. And so, how to delegate everything back to the provost does, in some ways, pass on, that is where we do pass off our responsibility protecting the institution of tenure itself. So I'm wondering what other people are thinking about in that regard.
Well, and I think maybe you're addressing the fifth question. What criteria should inform the final proposal? And I think you're implicitly saying we need a strong statement from the faculty, whatever committee group it is, that one of the principles is that we're not going to violate our commitment to tenure.
Yeah. So, we talked about, so similar to what Catherine said, and maybe because we're both from Deloitte, but I was pushing very much for that any task force that emerges would have representative for all four of these committees here, because faculty interests have to be represented here too. And also this idea of, the elimination of 7 lines is not, and maybe this is deliberate, you did not say tenure lines. So FTE, so that can be adjuncts, we can assume, or and
we left that open for you to assume.
Right, and it doesn't necessarily assume the elimination of programs. It can be, there has to be a strategy attached to it that's associated with retirements and other forms of attrition, but also more general mapping of the faculty and the curriculum. And so so I would never want to take faculty decision making out of the process here, ultimately, in the ultimate recommendation, I guess.
And while we're protecting faculty tenure and our own status, we're the liberal arts colleges of the Midwest. We have to protect knowledge.
Yeah.
We have to make sure that our institutions don't develop new programs in digital humanities for environmental, whatever studies that are, however fabulous, don't call upon our training and knowledge and expertise as faculty. We have to innovate in ways that keep certain ideas alive for future generations, whether current generations recognize their value immediately when they're 18 years old or not. It's very important.
We did leave it open on the status. And as most of you know, at least according to AAUP guidelines, getting rid of a program can only happen through a faculty vote and by a faculty decision. So I think the assumption, if that had come up, is we would say Halcyon would comply with that general practice. The only other way, of course, is declaring some kind of financial exigency. And we purposefully crafted the numbers so that is not the situation here, clearly. Could be. I mean, if we follow some of the, what David was saying yesterday, it could be in 10 years if we used one of his spreadsheets on Halcyon. But that's not where they are now.
Halcyon College is not in crisis.
Right, that's Bogota said it.
Line 1.
Yeah.
Right. Other comments that take us in a different direction or a variation? Yeah.
I guess I would say that is, Halcyon College is not in crisis unless you're someone who is going to eventually lose a job. I mean, I do think that part of what's involved here is the rhetoric that we use in these moments to be very clear about institutional problems and whether we call it a crisis or not. And I do think the other thing I want to say is it's absolutely important that people who make these decisions communicate clearly the basis of their decisions. And I have to say, I don't think our academic culture is very good about that.
Yeah.
I think administrative cultures have reached a kind of the less said the better. We don't want to go on record as saying this. There's some lawsuit, there's a worry that somebody's going to come out of the closet, corner, and sort of, beat us over the head with something we write in an email. And I think that's bad in a process like this, because in addition to, one of the ways you create transparency is that you're clear about a timeline, you're clear about goals, and you're clear when who's ever made the decision is absolutely clear the basis on which the decision was made. At least for someone who wasn't at the table to read it 5 years later. Say, well, okay, it was a bad decision, but at least I know the reasons for it. And I do think that's very important in this, that we have to do a better job at record keeping, at keeping minutes of meetings in which decisions are made.
Yeah.
And then freely available. I think this is actually a really good segue into our last little segment. We have 7 minutes left for this session before we turn it over to ACM again. And I know we could have a lot more time on this case study, but at this point we'd like you to reflect for 30 seconds and then talk a little bit about, think back to the whole conference that we've had. What kinds of takeaways do you have in mind to take back to talk with your colleagues in the plane on the way home or the car on the way home? Or maybe even to try to initiate conversation with other faculty leaders or even with your dean and president. I think you were sort of pointing in the need for some new dialogue or more dialogue. What comes to mind?
I think that St. Olaf doesn't really have a faculty budget committee as such, although some of the other institutions here do. So this whole experience has made me think that we need to have a clearer role for faculty to be involved in these kinds of discussions in the long-range planning. And the point that was made yesterday afternoon about how this really is a comprehensive approach, or requires a more comprehensive approach. So I'm interested in thinking about how that might, we can't have just a faculty budget committee, but we need to have people in all these different places thinking about these issues with access to data. And so I think that's something I would be taking away.
Clearly, and Chris and his communication with us in the organization of the workshop, clearly your presidents are interested in having faculty as informed participants in these kinds of discussions. So really, there are considerable opportunity costs to learn about budgeting and some of the financial operations of our institutions. And some of our campuses do a better job of regularly engaging faculty in those kinds of discussions than others. And I think clearly one of the things we want to do is to send folks back to their campuses, at least with some interest in trying to figure out how to routinize that engagement rather than passively kind of receive whatever reports we would receive in a faculty meeting or in other settings.
Another thought I have is that each of you was invited to come here, I think, by your dean or provost. And I don't know whether they have set up any kind of a reporting back mechanism for you when you get back to campus. If they do, then this would be a chance for you to digest things and think about a diplomatic way to raise issues that you want to. Yes, one more.
Well, one thing one of my colleagues mentioned, our contention is it would be great if some of the folks who gave presentations here could come to our campus and give some of those presentations to share this, so that we're not the only ones sharing the information.
So to spread the understanding and the knowledge and hopefully curiosity and care to the other faculty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or have some of the PowerPoints available that we've seen, so that background information.
No, yeah, I think we're going to make those available.
This is the segue maybe to David. Thank you all for engaging so
thank you very
carefully
much.
and so well.